morning, everyone. Welcome back to day 2 of the conference on religious trauma. We have a great day lined up for you today. I'm really excited about the presentations. And before we get started, I would like to give you my treaty acknowledgement. We are digitally connecting for this conference from all around the world, and many of us are joining from traditional territory. I am grateful to be located in the unceded territory of the Zook people in what is now known as the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia. And just a note about safety, the Conference on Religious Trauma is committed to safer spaces online. Racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, or harassment of any kind, including religious proselytizing, will not be tolerated. If at any time you experience such harassment or would like to make comments regarding safer spaces at CORT 2022, you can send a private message or email me directly at janice.selbie@gmail.com. This conference wouldn't be happening without some of our excellent sponsors. I'd like to remind you of them today. We are thanking Recovering from Religion, Religion in Remission, author Aaron Donnelly, and clinical psychologist Dr. Coco Owen. Thank you, sponsors. We appreciate you. And now the main event we're starting off with today, something that's really long overdue, and it's a panel on religious schooling, including religious homeschooling. Our moderator for this panel is Dr. Caleb W. Lack. Dr. Lack is a professor of psychology at the University of Central Oklahoma. He's a licensed clinical psychologist and an award-winning educator and best-selling author. Wow. Dr. Lack will introduce the rest of our panel and moderate the discussion. Thanks for moderating and welcome, Dr. Lack.
Thank you, Janice, for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here. I think this is going to be an excellent talk and, like you said, much needed information about the impact of religious schooling and religious homeschooling. So we've got 4 panelists today. I wanted to do just a brief introduction for each one of them. There are more expansive introductions, obviously, in the CORT just kind of handbook there. First up, we've got Beatrice Weber, who's a speaker, author, and activist who was raised in an ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. We've got Elam Zook, who is a writer, activist, community organizer, and co-founder of Amish Adrift. Then we'll have Jerusha Lofland, who's an artist, abortion rights activist, and public education advocate. And then we'll end up with Ryan Stollar, who is a child liberation theologian, an advocate for children and abuse survivors, and co-founder of Homeschoolers Anonymous. So each of our panelists will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A for about a half hour there at the end. So during this, please feel free to send in questions via the chat box, and we will get to those at the end. All right. But first, we're going to have Beatrice Weber speaking to us about religious schooling and the law.
Like many of you here, I grew up in a strict and insular religious community, the Ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. Growing up in that community, we had almost no connection with the rest of the world. Our friends were from the community. Most of the jobs the adults worked at were in the community. And of course, we attended schools that were created by members of the community for its adherents. From the young age of 3, we were sent to these schools. Boys went to one school, girls went to another school. There were very different curriculums at those schools. At the girls' schools, we'd spend the first half of the day until noontime learning Judaic studies, where we learned how to read Hebrew, and we learned how to read the texts, Jewish law, etc. And in the afternoon, we'd spend learning the secular subjects, right? So from like 1 to 4, we'd spend time on the different secular subjects. Now, those subjects were regularly marked up, okay? If there was any reference to, evolution, sex, or anything else that was considered undesirable, it would be blacked out, pages would be torn out of different textbooks, and it was basically a customized curriculum that was considered suitable for the students. Now, the boys, on the other hand, had longer days, okay, where they would stay much longer. My son, who is now 9 years old, for instance, starts at 8:35 and ends at 5:45. Most of that day is spent on learning Judaic studies, okay? The boys from the ages of 8 through 13 will have an hour to an hour and a half tacked on at the end of the day where they do some secular studies, again, which they call English. Now, in the past, those studies were often taught by public school teachers that at the end of the day, teaching public school, they'd come and teach for an hour and a half. But more recently, I would say over the last 20 years, that has shifted. And the teachers are usually Judaic study teachers who teach in the morning at these schools and then spend an extra hour, an hour and a half being paid a minimal amount of money to teach these children. Now, most of these teachers have not gotten an education themselves. They have gone to the same school system, so they can barely read at a 3rd or 4th grade level. It's important to mention that in the Judaic studies curriculum for the girls, there's a very strong emphasis on modesty, okay? So, the length of the sleeves of your skirt and, are really strong priorities and actually are sent home as part of the rules before you enter the school. In the boys, they emphasize a lot of the learning, how learning the Judaic studies are so important. That is the most important thing. We don't want to waste time on anything else. And in fact, as they get older, the boys, their school days can be almost 12 hours. And again, from when they're 13, they're not taught any secular subjects. Again, this is in the ultra-Orthodox community. Again, both the girls and the boys are taught of their unique space, their unique place in the world, as the chosen people. Part of what's kind of underlying that is fear of other people and the fact that, the need to stay separate and the need to, for the community to provide for its own education. Okay, when I got married at 18, to an up-and-coming rabbi, there was no question of where I would send my kids to school. It was a given that I would send them to the same schools that me and my sibling went to. It wasn't even a conversation. It was just a given. I remember one of my older sons, when he was about 13, he was really struggling in school. And I wanted to send him to another school that be able to provide for his needs. And they would also, give him a robust education. He'd end up with a high school diploma, right? And I remember my parents calling me up in such a panic and saying you can't send him there. That's not okay. And again, this was still, a Jewish Orthodox school, but it wasn't, ultra-Orthodox. So that was already considered a no-no. Absolutely not. That was just not something that was allowed to do. Now, you might ask, why don't parents send to other schools, right? I live in New York. There's a lot of schools, a lot of private schools, public schools. Why don't they? Don't they know they have other options? So, first of all, there's a lot of fear, as I mentioned before, of outsiders. So sending your child to the outside world is really considered dangerous and bad, the influences it might have from a religious perspective. But in general, just the fear of outsiders, where we are, must be the best. There's no way that there can be something better. So they can't, it's impossible to even think of that option. Now, there's another factor that for parents, and there are many parents that desperately want a better education for their children, they know that there are serious consequences if you do send your child to outside the community for schooling. So first of all, there's going to be social ostracization. You will not be accepted in the community. And when your only social circle is in the community, facing that social ostracization could be devastating. Also, arranged marriages, right? You're never going to be able to marry off your children. And the thought of that oftentimes really prevents parents from taking that step or making that choice. In addition, if you're used to finding jobs in the community, having the social support of the community, you're not going to have that anymore. The risk is just too high. Now, I left my marriage in 2014 and several years later, the community. But even after I left my marriage, after 22 years, 10 children, I still did not have the choice of where to send my 4 youngest children who were living with me. Okay. I left with my 4 younger ones. They were with me. I actually even had full custody of them, but yet I could not make a choice. The family court judge's ruling was very clear. I needed to continue sending my children to similar schools as to where they had been before. That means ultra-Orthodox schools. Okay. There was no way that I was allowed to make that change. In 2018, I sent my daughter, who's the second youngest of my children, to a religious school that was a little bit of a different type of religious school. As a result of that, I received an onslaught of order to show causes from family court, and I had to keep on showing up, and I was severely reprimanded for doing that. Ultimately, she was allowed to attend that school, but I knew that there was no way I was going to be able to do anything about switching her son, her younger brother. I knew that something had to change, because at that point, I did not want to just have to sit around and have my youngest son go through the same type of education as my older sons. Now, my older sons, some of them have chosen to be Talmudic scholars and spend their day learning. You know, they do that with a combination of getting support from their in-laws, getting, social supports from the government. And that's fine. They're well prepared for that. But my sons that wanted to get a job, wanted to get in higher education, it was just like so beyond them. Like my older sons, they need help with filling out a basic application for job application. They don't have the training for that. So in 2019, I filed a complaint with the help of Yafet, an organization that was founded to deal with these issues. And I filed a complaint to the school, to New York City, and eventually to New York State, complaining that my son was not receiving an education. Now, let me make it clear. We actually do have a mandatory education law in New York State, as there is in most states. However, the lawmakers have really been lax in enforcing this law. And even now, when it has been brought to their attention, they've really been lax in following up on it and in enforcing it. And, I'll explain some of that dynamic as to why that is happening and what is happening with that. But the fact is that there are tens of thousands of children in New York City and New York State that are not receiving even the basics, okay? They are ending up leaving schools with not even being able to read on the 3rd or 4th grade level, never mind anything like algebra, reading Shakespeare, history, science. There's none of that. Now, it may surprise you, knowing of those facts, that I was the first and only parent thus far who has filed a complaint of this kind. Now, the fear of stepping out is so strong. It really is so strong that when I filed, I was terrified. Now, some of what the complaint included was I had never received a schedule, never received a curriculum. And to be honest, they don't have one. They don't have people on staff with the expertise to do that. I met with the principal once, and he was very proud to tell me this is very passionate for him. He has 2 other jobs, and he comes here because this means so much to him. But in fact, he told me they don't have time to teach a full curriculum because they don't have time, right? Because it's all done in an hour at the end of the day. But instead, they teach tidbits of information. Now, this complaint that I filed back in 2019, okay, when my son was just turning 7 years old, is still winding through the courtroom. He's now 9.5. Now, our first court hearing was finally a month ago, and the judge finally did insist that they come up, New York State and New York City come up with a final investigation, which they said they would, depending on if the school cooperates. So we still have that before us. Now, I was terrified to file this complaint. One of the kind of principles that we were raised with was the absolute terribleness of something called a moser, which I guess you can spell M-O-S-E-R. It's a Hebrew word and translates to snitch. Okay, being a snitch could, back in Eastern Europe, make one liable to be killed. We were told stories of people who were snitches and ended up being found dead in the neighboring river. So even though I no longer believed it, and I knew this was the right thing. Still, like when you're told this, and I'm sure there's been a lot of conversation about this throughout the conference, when you're told this from a young age, those deepest fear remains. And I was also terrified of the consequences. I knew that this would have a repercussion on the schools in terms of their investigations, right? They would start getting investigated. And I knew that the community would not just accept this. And most of my fears have come true. So I lost my job in the community. I had a job in the community several months after I filed the complaint. Gratefully, I have a great job, not in the community, so it's all good. I was regularly stalked and had to move out of the community and a mile away to ensure our safety. The school actually sent the principal and a board member to the family court as witnesses for my son's father, okay? And those sessions were actually held in the school. Now, internet use is officially not allowed, but the school has the internet. So they went there and testified for the court. And all of a sudden, my son's father had a top-notch, aggressive lawyer who dragged me continuously to family court. I assume people were funding that because he does not have access himself to that kind of money. I actually did lose custody of my son for a short while last year, but was able to appeal the case, and he did come back. And again, this happened. The school actively got involved, wrote a letter to the court after I moved a mile away, saying that how terrible it would be for my son because I moved that mile away, and he would be exposed to children from other communities. So these fears that people in the community have, even if they want to send their child to better school, even if they want to speak up, it's absolutely terrifying. Now, the impact of this lack of education is huge, right? First of all, on a personal level, right, for every person not to get an education. But from a more global level, some of the biggest issues are, first of all, poverty. The fact is that some of the ultra-Orthodox communities, the Jewish ultra-Orthodox communities in the United States, have the highest rates of poverty and are really dependent on government programs. Now, this comes as a tremendous cost to taxpayers, and this is only increasing as the community is growing. And in addition, unlike some other small religious communities, members of the community are very, very active voters, okay? They are voting. And they often play a significant role in determining the winning candidate, especially in local elections. And as the numbers of the community grows, obviously, this will have more and more of an impact. And because so many of them don't have that education, right, don't have that background, they rely on their leaders, on their rabbis to tell them who to vote for, okay? So it is well known in the community that if a politician will make promises to the leaders, they will get what is called a block vote. They will get all those adherents of the community to come out and vote for a specific candidate. As recently as the last mayoral election, the two top candidates, and Adams and Yang, publicly stated that they are for continuing the way the yeshiva education is run. Let's continue it. We think it's great. I was involved in a campaign to reach 1 million people to talk to them about this issue with a robocall. And I was shocked when advocates and reporters called that anti-Semitic and called me out on that and others and saying that it was anti-Semitic. And, I stated to a reporter at that time, I don't think there was anything more pro-Jewish and pro-human than working to ensure that every child receives an education. So thank you. Thank you, Professor, for giving me the time to speak.
Thank you, Beatrice. I really appreciated hearing about that, especially for, so many of us who are not super familiar with that ultra-Orthodox community and the kinds of education that's often engaged there. I think that was very enlightening for, I'm sure, many of us. So thank you. Well, our next speaker is Elam Zook, who's going to be talking about weaponizing religious freedom, how religious zealots hijacked the American experiment. Thank you, Elam.
So thank you for having me. I appreciated that contribution. That was a forensic examination of the ills of religious freedom. So mine will be a little bit less of a dive into the actual specifics, but I do want to say that religious freedom is a problem. We need to have a discussion about that. And a reference point that I use is, take, for example, the court case Roe versus Wade. We have chewed about it, talked about it, advocated it. It's been nonstop for decades and decades. If we just gave a tiny bit of that attention to Wisconsin versus Yoder and the issues of religious freedom, we'd be much better off in terms of being able to address and respond to the problems that the last speaker so eloquently pointed out. And so there's a couple things I hope to leave you with today, and the first one is that religious freedom is a problem. We have to address it. The second one is that my supporting argument there is that the Amish are a reflection of the dominant culture, not a separate anomaly. The Amish are who they are because of religious extremism in the dominant culture. Their very identity is formed not out of their own values, but because they have been groomed to function as a foil to advance these ideas that the religious right is putting forth, that white Christians are special. They are worthy of special treatment. And just to give you a little bit of an example of what that means, Lars Stoltzfus Brown wrote a paper titled "Why White People Love the Amish," and it's basically she basically makes the point that that the Amish get used by the dominant culture to advance the idea that this idealistic portrayal of who the Amish are is it's used to advance the idea that white Christians are special. And one of the references she makes is that Native American children were forced into schools where they were punished for speaking their own language. They were abducted, literally abducted, and forced into schools, all in the name of assimilation. And only several decades after that stopped, the Amish were granted unilateral, exemption to reject assimilation. And it's I want to phrase that rejection. What the Yoder ruling advanced was a mentor of mine referenced it this way, that the United States Constitution was the most enlightened document on the face of the earth when it was written. Our country was founded on a devotion and allegiance to the Enlightenment. That's who we are as a nation. And what the Yoder ruling did was say it's okay to reject that, to completely disaffiliate from that legacy. And it's important to understand that this is not about the Amish. The Amish were used to put it forward. And I'd like to point out liberals were just as culpable for doing it because they agreed with it. I don't have the time to go into it, but the court ruling on, the case, Wisconsin versus Yoder, is fraudulent through and through. There's just no integrity to it. But the liberals on the court thought they could slip it in and it would be okay. And it's not okay. It is a mechanism through which the religious right has put forth this idea, which, if you look at the homeschool lobby, that was their ultimate goal. The homeschool lobby is the crowning achievement to come out of Wisconsin versus Yoder, which is the complete and total rejection of any oversight or influence that the government is allowed to have on education. And that's there's a fundamental flaw to that this idea that government formed by the people is somehow not allowed to set any standards about what it wants its citizens to learn. I would go so far as to say that is completely unsustainable. It needs to be stopped. The propaganda that is set forth under those ideals are they're definitely destroying the Amish. And the point I would want to make is that the Amish are not, again, they're not a separate entity. They are the canary in the coal mine. The social ills playing out in the Amish community are the result of religious authoritarianism run amok in the dominant culture, and what's happening to the Amish is going to happen to our country at large. An example of that, again, would be the homeschool situation. It would be the right-wing sort of echo chamber of, say, Trump and an alternate reality, because we haven't learned to base our arguments on reason and critical thought. There's an entire generation, several generations of people who are arguing these fraudulent ideas under the umbrella of religious freedom. We have the right to say whatever we want, no matter how ridiculous it is, and secular society has bamboozled itself into thinking that it's required to give space to dark age ideology. It's utter and complete nonsense, and it needs to stop. And I'll stop right there and give space to the next speaker.
Thank you, Elam. I think that's a really interesting premise that I think most of us probably haven't heard of, kind of considering the Amish really as that, you said, a canary in the coal mine, right? So kind of seeing them as a test case really for issues like religious freedom. So I appreciate that. Elam. Well, our next speaker is Jerusha Lofland, and she's going to be giving us a talk that's entitled Working Through the Compound Trauma of Religious Homeschooling.
Hello. I was 7 when my evangelical parents pulled me out of school. They wanted to protect me from evils like Halloween, evolution, situational ethics. No one really knew what homeschooling was back then, or if it was even legal. My parents made it up as they went. And while there were things I missed about school, I adapted. I knew my upbringing was unusual, but I thought I got a decent education. Sure, some years we spent more time studying interpretations of the Bible than doing actual schoolwork. Some assignments were more like punishments, like when we searched our souls for sins of omission to confess, or the day I was allowed to eat nothing but alfalfa sprouts to learn humility. But all our friends were homeschooled by radical Christians, so normal was relative. Every time we went out, people would compliment my parents. They're so well behaved. Other adults said they'd want to be kids at our house. I thought about that a lot because I often imagined living somewhere else. I was doing school in my bedroom, but in my imagination, I was living in a school with different teachers for every subject. Then my parents joined Bill Gothard's homeschool cult, the Institute, or IBLP, which is a story for another day. I eventually married a boy I met in the cult. For years, we had nightmares about the Institute. On some level, we knew we'd been mistreated, but we didn't have language yet for psychological trauma. We spent years picking the cult out of our brains. We also had 3 kids very quickly because it took a while to figure out how much of what we'd been told about sex and family planning simply wasn't true, which was upsetting because we tried so hard to do exactly everything the way we were told. Again, without understanding the concept of trauma, I only knew there was a year of my baby's life I couldn't remember. My mom, between 11 babies and homeschooling, wasn't available to do much mothering, and I wanted to be available to my little ones. When they were old enough, I started homeschooling because it was what I'd been trained for. Schools were for people who didn't love their kids enough to want to be with them all day. School was my mother's threat on days she reached the end of her rope. Maybe I should just put you in school. Sometimes we wish she would. In my state, no one needs credentials to homeschool. I only had to mail in one form. I guess it proved I knew what I was doing. I bought some workbooks, made some flashcards, and we were good to go. In 6 years, no one ever checked to see if I actually knew what I was doing. I call this approach education on the honor system. No one asks if the kids will be supervised or left to teach themselves or each other while mom cares for the baby or stays in her room or even goes to work. No one wonders if the teachers are violent, if they punish disabilities as character deficiencies, if the home has unsecured weapons, if students are malnourished, if they dread sexual assault from teachers or classmates, if they're allowed to have friends. Will they ever see other adults? No one asks if academics will be the homeschool's primary focus or if they come second to, say, running a family business or promoting an ideology. My parents valued character development over knowledge. Chores often counted as school, also childcare, as did quiet time, which I sometimes used to masturbate to biblical rape stories. I was the only student with memory of what classroom learning had been like. When I complained about the new institute curriculum, I was told I had a bad attitude, a serious offense in fundamentalist homes. These, shall we say, flexibilities inherent in the homeschool model are what some people love about it. They celebrate this as freedom and school choice. So there I was, a homeschool mom, free to teach whatever, however I wanted. Cool. Teaching kids to read is one of my superpowers. I loved turning my living room into a linguistics lab. But as my kids got a little older, the realization of how much power and control I had over them was frankly terrifying. I'd spent years defending my parents. At the time, my younger self needed to believe that the grown-ups in charge had things under control. But watching my kids, I couldn't excuse my parents anymore. They had abused their power. We behaved well because we'd been traumatized. I didn't want to raise obedient kids. I wanted them to expect compassion and respect themselves. And why did people assume that I knew everything my children needed and how to give it to them? They were only my kids because I liked sex. This honor system education felt like driving through mountains with no guardrail. I wished someone would at least look over my shoulder. There were kids in the car. In a way, being a homeschool mom felt a lot like my teen years. setting my own goals, grading my own work, hoping I got it right. No parent, no matter how motivated or gifted, is qualified to teach every subject at every grade level. By about 8th grade, if I couldn't teach it to myself from textbook, I didn't learn it. I could recite whole psalms, but I had 0 STEM courses. Missionary biographies by the dozen, yes, but no literature. Dad said housewives wouldn't need algebra. When I asked Mom what humanities were, she frowned and said there was nudity. Art museums off limits. I thought I had a decent education, but homeschooling was giving me doubts. I had resources, though, where my parents had to pass around mimeographed lists of textbook publishers. I could visit my homeschool book fair in my own city, where I found, marbled through all the cool stuff that wasn't available 30, 40 years ago. There was a lot that was upsettingly familiar. Materials from the IBLP cult, quiverful books, young earth science programs, alternate Christian nationalist history, manuals for abusive parenting and female submission. But it was the t-shirts that bothered me most. One for sale said, "Warning, unsocialized homeschooler." Another had a joke about hell. At that stage in my recovery, I wasn't sure what I believed about hell, but whether it was real or an invention to terrorize children afraid of losing their grandparents, it's a terrible barbecue punchline. And that word unsocialized, it just unleashed a torrent of memories, strangers confronting my parents. But what about socialization? I'm learning to answer, oh, we get along with people of all ages. Because we thought socialization meant going to church potlucks sometimes. And here I was in my 30s. My closest friends were homeschool women I found online. We were helping each other figure out everything from hygiene to fashion to birth control to relationships and raising children with kindness. We were socializing each other the best we could after years inside an authoritarian experiment that left us at a disadvantage in mainstream society. That day at the book fair, I just wanted to pass as normal. And people thought being unsocialized was funny. What else did they think was funny? Homeschoolers with eating disorders? The cutting, the suicide attempts, the loneliness, the substance abuse, the runaways, the sexual vulnerability, the lack of job skills, the abusive relationships, the anxiety, depression. Or was that just my family? Because those well-behaved children were struggling. Maybe we'd rather be socialized if we'd had the choice. I had to leave the convention center that day and sit in my car until I could regulate my emotions enough to finish shopping. I began having more and more of these episodes of overlapping anger and anxiety and intrusive homeschool memories. I started college classes to fill some of my own educational gaps. I chewed gum through biology till my jaw ached. My physical symptoms kept getting worse. A doctor finally explained I was experiencing panic attacks. Maybe I hadn't turned out as well as I thought. When I started working with a therapist, he explained a concept called differentiation. I could develop my own boundaries, resilience, values, separate from my family of origin. It was something that should have happened years ago, like getting permanent teeth. You might think that parents who choose do-it-yourself education would raise a more independent generation. But when you layer high control homeschooling over high demand religion, you can raise kids with no sense of self at all. Fragmented humans, divorced from their bodies and desires. Children raised without bodily autonomy and told that they deserve hell don't learn personal boundaries. Over time, my family became its own cult. We were so isolated, people even noticed we had our own accent. We had rules for everything, rules for boys, rules for girls, what we could wear, what we had to wear, what we could eat, when, where, how much. We once had to inventory our individual possessions and then in front of the family, renounce or yield to God our rights to personal property. The brother who refused and stood up for himself, despite pressure, strong pressure from authority figures, was shamed for his willfulness. My parents would confiscate toys, books, gifts they thought might displease God. Some they burned in the backyard fire pit. Dad put a rock through our television, heavily censored our music and movies, even Christian ones. Everything was sexualized, no matter how innocent. And sexual pleasure, if it was discussed at all, was shamed. Our bodies were shamed for wanting too much food, too much sleep, too much attention, too much comfort. I remember watching my young siblings act out torture fantasies with their dolls in a kind of quiet revenge for the way their bodies had been violated with repeated spankings that left deep purple bruises. We learned not to try to protect ourselves. Our parents hit us because they loved us, they said. At age 12, in an English assignment, I described myself as an abomination to God and got a perfect grade. The last time my father spanked me was over a geography project. I was a teenager, as tall as my mom, wearing a blouse and long wool skirt, angry at being made to lie across his lap as he sat on my brother's bunk bed to slap my backside with one of the wooden spoons conveniently stowed all over the house. And afterward, I had to apologize. My parents wrapped themselves in God's authority, braiding the piety with abuse. We had no doubt that, like Abraham, they would sacrifice us if their God asked them to. Many school days began with toddlers screaming in the next room as they were being beaten. Our parents intended to break our wills. But what broke was our hearts and our sense of agency. Even our interior privacy was stolen. The eyes of the Lord are in every place. God hears your thoughts. We were taught having secrets from parents exposed us to spiritual attack. When my husband and I finally left religion altogether, he couldn't get over the wonder that for the first time in his life, he felt he had his mind all to himself. When a child goes to school, they have an entire intellectual and emotional experience separate from their family. I'm endlessly fascinated by how my kids can carve out new identities at school. And every year is a new opportunity to experiment and explore. Some of my siblings had the same two teachers from birth to graduation. Imagine the same tensions and conflict patterns on a loop 24/7 for 18 years. The same person who changed your diapers signs your diploma. I remember feeling trapped by my mom's perception of me. I used to beg God for opportunities outside my family, space to change and grow. Years later, I realized my mom was trapped too. She was suicidal for years of her homeschool career. Only the fear of hell kept her from taking her own life. Back-to-back pregnancies ruined her mental health. She called herself a living sacrifice. She never saw a therapist. She didn't even get prenatal care. Jesus was our physician. We only saw doctors when absolutely necessary, like when my sister's lung collapsed from undiagnosed asthma. I would recount these stories to my therapist, and her answers would introduce terms new to me. I'd go home and read up on postpartum psychosis, emotional incest, post-traumatic stress. Learning about religious trauma and complex PTSD unlocked so much. It hadn't been spiritual warfare at all. It was our brains processing fear. The more I worked through my homeschool trauma, the grief, the anger, the helplessness of not being able to protect young siblings, the more open I was to sending my kids to school. When we did enroll our oldest, I felt a little guilt for making her our family guinea pig. Schools aren't perfect by any means, but I'm still awed watching a team of adults focus every single day on helping other people's kids. Of course, first time I got a note from the social worker, I was offended. Yeah, my kid had a few sick days. When I homeschooled, no one would notice. We could have taken off for a month. But when I realized all that note represented, I was so proud. I had given my child a support system. It was someone's job to make sure he had access to medical care. And feeling that support was healing for me because I deserved better. We deserved better. On behalf of all those homeschooled adults whose childhoods were sacrificed to their parents' God, every child, regardless of their parents' religious beliefs, deserves to be educated, supported, and safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerusha, for sharing that. I'm sure that resonated strongly with many of the folks that are attending who have had those similar kinds of experiences and hopefully had those similar kinds of journeys like you did out of that into a bit of a wider world. So thank you again. Our final panelist for today is Ryan Stollar, and his talk is titled Traumatic Homeschooling: How Evangelicals Use Education to Totalize.
I'd like to begin by thanking Janice for inviting me to speak here, and I'd like to thank my fellow panelists as well as Caleb for moderating. Religious trauma is such an important topic, and childhood education is a key vehicle for passing that trauma on from generation to generation. I will speak to you today about homeschooling, specifically evangelical homeschooling. I will speak about homeschooling because homeschooled children and alumni are intimately familiar with religious trauma. This is because the vast majority of homeschoolers are evangelical Christians. Consequently, many homeschooled children have experienced corporal punishment, threats of eternal hellfire, educational neglect, molestation and rape, and other human rights abuses, all in the name of glorifying the evangelical God. In fact, due to the intentionally deregulated state of homeschool laws in the United States, homeschool parents have nearly absolute power over what they can do to and teach their children. Homeschooling has thus become a tool for what psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton has called totalism. Totalism is the end goal of authoritarian and totalitarian movements. It is the total control of human action and belief. By enabling homeschoolers to use homeschooling totalistically, deregulated homeschooling has created the perfect storm for abuse and neglect to thrive in homeschooling communities. To understand how this became the case, a short history lesson is in order. From the very beginning of the modern homeschooling movement, paths diverged. In the 1960s and 1970s, John Holt, a liberal and early advocate for children's rights, began calling for the liberation of children from institutional, especially public schools. His books, How Children Fail and How Children Learn, provoked controversy for their criticisms of compulsory education for children. Holt advocated for an underground railroad that would help children leave institutional schools and pursue their own interests. At the same time that Holt was imagining a child-centric form of homeschooling, R.J. Rushdoony was similarly calling for the removal of children from public schools. Rushdoony called them government schools, and he had a very different vision of education than Holt. Rushdoony saw education as a tool of dominion, as a way to re-Christianize the United States. Known as the father of Christian Reconstructionism, Rushdoony advocated for the destruction of democracy and replacing it with a theocracy based on his understanding of Mosaic law. According to Rushdoony, government should never be in the education business. That business belongs solely to parents. For Rushdoony, then, homeschooling was parent-centric. It was a way to shore up parental rights, not children's rights. While homeschooling began with diverse founders, it was ultimately Rushdoony's vision that dominated. White evangelicals were desperate in the 1980s for a way to teach their children in the ways that they wanted, free from secular and non-white influences. Thus, they flooded the homeschooling movement. By the mid-1980s, white evangelicals had solidly commandeered the movement, becoming the most dominant group to choose homeschooling. This transformed the movement from a revolt against the institutionalization of schooling into a project to build a parallel Christian society. By 1990, 85 to 90% of homeschoolers were conservative Christians. And most importantly, the most powerful homeschool lobbying organization in the United States, HSLDA, was run and continues to be run exclusively by white evangelical men. Founded in 1983, HSLDA has fought for decades to promote what HSLDA attorney Michael Donnelly refers to as a minimalistic regulatory approach to homeschooling. In short, HSLDA believes homeschooling should be entirely free of any government oversight. This parental rights absolutism is a fundamental conviction that has roots in Rushdoony's worldview of Christian Reconstructionism, a worldview shared by HSLDA founder Michael Ferris, who is now president of the hate group Alliance Defending Freedom. HSLDA's efforts have been extraordinarily successful. There is no federal oversight of homeschooling whatsoever. Homeschooling is regulated only on the state level, and most states have either minimal or no oversight over homeschooling. An analysis of state homeschool laws by ProPublica in 2015 found that, quote, fewer than half require any kind of evaluation or testing of homeschool children, and just 10 require parents to have a high school degree. Furthermore, only 2 states prohibit convicted child abusers like child molesters from homeschooling. There are no states that require homeschool children to have regular contact with mandatory reporters. When states do have minimal oversight, most of the time, the oversight has few to no enforcement mechanisms. This lack of oversight has essentially created a loophole for child abusers. Abusers can remove their children from public school during open child abuse or neglect investigations, and thereby eliminate the chance that their children will ever be in contact with mandatory reporters again. Because homeschooling has become the perfect way to isolate and hide an abused or neglected child from those who could help the child, it has become a breeding ground for crimes against children. Since 1986, there have been at least 172 fatalities in homeschool settings from child abuse and neglect, suggesting homeschool children have a greater risk of dying from child abuse than other children. A 2014 survey of 3,702 homeschool alumni found that around half, 51%, experienced childhood abuse, and a further 26% reported knowing another homeschool child who was abused. And a survey of extreme cases of child torture conducted by pediatrician Barbara Knox in 2014 found that 47% of the tortured children who had been enrolled in school were removed under the auspices of homeschooling. Homeschooling, Knox observed, appears to have been designed to further isolate the child. As the first few generations of homeschool children have come of age, we have begun to see and hear the results of deregulated homeschooling, or as HSLDA calls it, a minimalistic regulatory approach. Starting in the early 2010s, homeschool children, by then adults, began calling for reform based on their experiences of abuse and neglect. As someone homeschooled kindergarten through high school graduation by evangelical parents, I am intimately familiar with this history. I lived it. I am also very familiar with the growing movement of homeschool alumni who are speaking out about their experiences and demanding communal and legal reforms to protect future generations of children. I helped found several national nonprofit organizations to fight for the rights of homeschool children. And what I see as the common thread between all the stories of abuse and neglect in homeschooling is the issue of totalism. Totalism is a concept first developed by psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton in his 1961 book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. Totalism is related to totalitarianism and signifies a psychological form of it, the totalitarian monitoring and control of another individual's behaviors and thoughts. Lifton uses the term to describe the attributes of ideological movements and organizations that aim for total control over people's behaviors and thoughts. While these movements and organizations may vary in design and goals, They follow common patterns and they cause predictable types of psychological damage to those within them. Evangelical Christians, as well as other extremist groups, are drawn to homeschooling because it gives them either absolute or nearly absolute power over their children. They would describe this power as freedom, and indeed, to some extent, that is true. Marginalized groups like Black families are also attracted to homeschooling because it does give them freedom to teach things public schools cannot or will not teach, such as Black and Native American history. But that freedom is a double-edged sword. By giving absolute power to parents, homeschooling can be used to control children as much as it is used to free children. And evangelical Christians are interested in control. Evangelical Christians are interested in creating a parallel society. They are interested in creating safe spaces, essentially, where their children will never encounter people or ideas that contradict their teachings until those children are properly equipped to defend those teachings and not stray from them despite any evidence that they are wrong. This is why evangelical Christians invest significantly in fields of study like apologetics and worldview studies. There are books and homeschool curricula and summer camps and college programs all dedicated to keeping children and young adults from straying from white evangelical Christian values, usually defined as white supremacy, Christian nationalism, capitalism, and the supremacy of heterosexual marriage and sexuality. By giving evangelical Christians absolute power over their children, homeschooling enables and empowers these parents to create these parallel societies in the most efficient and effective manner. Homeschool parents literally control every aspect of their children's lives, for better or for worse. For evangelical parents, this means they can ensure their children never leave their safe spaces until the parents feel confident that the children are adequately totalized. Should children ever become rebellious or ask too many questions, it's off to worldview camp or a troubled teen program. I regularly hear from fellow homeschool alumni that they literally never encountered someone who was not a white evangelical until they were well into adulthood. This is how successfully white evangelicals have mastered totalism. With the existence of many evangelical colleges and graduate schools, this parallel society has the potential to cocoon a person from birth until their mid-20s, even their 30s. But cocoon is the wrong word. This parallel society isn't something that protects children. This parallel society constricts. That is, it slowly but surely constricts children into the model of what white evangelicals are supposed to be: Christian nationalists, fervent capitalists, and in no way queer. I know I don't have to explain to you that constricting children for the sake of religious beliefs causes trauma. You all know that constricting children into what adults want and need is the best way to traumatize a child for life. And add religion on top of that, and you get the circumstances that make conferences on religious trauma an increasingly common phenomenon. But let me take this a step further and suggest that when you intentionally inflict religious trauma on children, it is child abuse. And that's what evangelicals are doing here. They are intentionally using totalistic education and all its related tools to traumatize children in the directions they believe children should grow and mature. Intentionally inflicting religious trauma on children is what Janet Heimlich and the Child Friendly Faith Project called religious child maltreatment. It is real and it is pervasive in homeschooling circles, and make no mistake, it is devastating. Furthermore, there's no excuse for it. Religion does not have to hurt children. You always have a choice whether to use religion to liberate children or to radicalize and traumatize them. I know it is common these days for evangelicals and other conservatives to carelessly throw around the word grooming. And as a child abuse survivor myself and someone with a master's in child protection, this infuriates me. The carelessness is bad in and of itself, but the worst part is knowing that the whole point of evangelicals' parallel society is to break their children's wills, to disempower them, and to make them like clay, moldable and pliant to adults' wishes. And I cannot think of a better way to prepare a child for future abuse and trauma than that. By stripping children of their wills, by supplanting their children's unique and diverse identities with the identity demanded by white evangelical leaders, evangelicalism is teaching and homeschooling is enabling and empowering it. That children have no rights to themselves, that they are not their own, that they owe their bodies, minds, and souls to those more powerful to them. As a child protection professional, it doesn't evade me that these messages are textbook definitions of either grooming or outright emotional or religious abuse. Yet these messages are also central aspects of many religious teachings that require, especially when it comes to evangelicalism. That's more than a red flag to me. It's a sign that the foundation of evangelicalism is compromised and corrupted. And unless we take a serious look at how evangelicals and other religious extremists take advantage of childhood education, including homeschooling, private schools, and public charter schools, as a primary vehicle for inflicting religious child maltreatment, we will be powerless to stop it. This is why it's so important to listen and include the voices of those who have experienced this education. And so I'm grateful for being included here. I'm grateful for the voices of the fellow homeschool alumni like Jerusha and Luna. And I hope you hear in our stories not just our own pain, but our hope that we can do better for future generations of children. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. I appreciated that. And then really getting some of the kind of the historical aspects there of homeschooling and those movements that have resulted in a lot of what our other speakers have been talking about today. So I really appreciated that. So just kind of thinking about, the common themes that I'm hearing across these speakers, and it really is, the use of religious homeschooling as a means and method of control. And that, of course, makes, I think, sense given most of our psychological, sociological, anthropological hypotheses about, why and how religions exist. When I control the information a child is given during this, critical time for social, moral, and cognitive development, I'm really trying to control who that child will be for the rest of their life. And although, I know it was difficult for our panelists, I really appreciated hearing the diverse ways in which homeschooling really can be abused under this guise of religious freedom. And, the results of that, which are not just intellectual and educational neglect, but also social and emotional neglect, physical abuse and neglect, and many other negative long-term consequences. And, for me, as someone who's really involved in trying to teach critical thinking skills across all sorts of different kinds of populations, I can't help but kind of see those similarities between that parallel Christian nationalist society that Ryan was talking about and what we've seen over the last decade in terms of a parallel national society with politics, with health, with tons of other issues, here in our nation where large swaths of our population have become kind of increasingly insular, right? And unwilling to be exposed to different viewpoints, unwilling to be exposed or let their children be exposed to disconfirming information that goes against those deeply held beliefs that they have. So I really, really appreciated everyone on the panel. We've got about 25 minutes left, and as such, I've got some questions that have come in from people watching. And we're just going to kind of open this up. I'll throw questions out there, and whoever wants to speak that's on the panel about that, feel free to chime in, and we'll kind of keep the conversation going. So several folks in the chat wanted to know about what can we do to fix this, right? So that's kind of my first thing that I want to put out there is, what could we do to fix this? Should homeschooling generally just be completely abolished? Should it be more regulated? Should you require specific training for someone who's going to be doing homeschool-based education? And so I just wanted to kind of get your thoughts from those of you who are really in the trenches on that, about, what can we do differently, or how could we fix that?
Well, in my state, we don't even have a census of homeschooled children. We don't know how many are being homeschooled. And anytime there's the slightest effort by the legislature to allow some oversight or regulation, most people scream choice, religious freedom. And so we need to have people speaking to their legislators about this and bringing up whatever cases perhaps in their own area, their own state, where there has been perhaps examples of abuse, and let people know. Because I've talked to legislators that just had no idea. They imagined that homeschool kids were safe because their parents cared enough to keep them home.
I'd say that there are, there's two different paths we could take to address these issues when it comes to homeschooling. And I'm sure there's parallels here with private religious education that the others can speak to. But for homeschooling specifically, I think we can either address the issues through community solutions or through government solutions. And I think we need both. On the community level, we need people who are homeschooling to start speaking up and, demanding child protection policies on their homeschool groups. We need to have people educating homeschool communities about child abuse prevention and mental health issues. And then on the government side, of course, I do think there needs to be some meaningful oversight over homeschooling as well. I think that's where a lot of people get freaked out because of what Jerusha was saying. There's this idea of religious freedom and like school choice. But at the same time, I think we need to address it from both sides. We need to reform the communities from within. And then we also, there's only so much you can do, though, with internal reform. We also need to impose some sort of guidelines and rules as well.
Especially if the reform won't happen internally, right?
Exactly, yeah. Which it won't. I mean, unfortunately, for a lot of communities like these.
Am I on?
Yep.
You'll maybe figure out that my favorite hobby horse is religious freedom, and I would just say that fundamentally we have to understand that religious freedom is a fraud in this country. It's understood in a way that is plain and simple fraudulent. And the example is, of course, my experience. The Yoder ruling was not. There's just no legitimacy there. But an example of it is that it was represented to the public that what's happening here is the government is forcing secular education onto Amish children. And that's just straightforward a lie. That's, you've got to understand, first of all, everything you know about the Amish is propaganda. But the Amish were not the only religious people who were skeptical of secular education. And they were absolutely free, just like those people, to create something that they felt comfortable with. And the government was practically bending over backwards to give people that freedom. But instead of doing that, what the Yoder ruling created was a situation where the government was, and you see if I can say this without revoking the censures, that the government needs to completely stand back. And that's what the Yoder ruling achieved. And it was completely unnecessary. The Amish were absolutely, completely, totally free to create an educational system that would have worked with them. Here's another example of this. I attended a plain community-run school prior to 1972, which was when the Yoder ruling happened. So back then, they were already brokering compromises, which I'm not saying were a bad thing. The bad thing is to decouple education from the American experiment of this allegiance to reason and critical thought. That's what the Yoder ruling did, and that's the flaw. That's the problem. And if we don't solve that, we're going to have a lot of pain and heartache in our future.
Yeah, I like that idea of the uncoupling there, Elam, where it's separating out, what many of us see were the kind of key values of the Enlightenment, which really the United States was supposed to be this shining example of, and then no, let's get rid of that and let you do anything that you want to under the guise, like you said, of religious freedom. So, Beatrice, what are your thoughts about this?
Yeah, I can't talk to homeschooling because that's not within my experience. But in regards to the religious education, the first thing we can talk to is the government oversight. The fact is that in New York State and in many other states, if not most states, have compulsory education. Right, 100 years ago in New York State, it made a law that children need to receive an education. Before that, it was not required, but it is required. And the fact that religion is being used as a reason not to provide that education is wrong, is absolutely wrong. And the fact that politicians buy into it is wrong. In New York State, I would
looks like
really only started in the 1950s after the Holocaust, and nobody did anything from the. Oh, did I lose you?
We can hear you.
Oh, I think we lost. Just a minute. Looks like we lost Beatrice. We'll get her back here in a second, I think. Well, kind of while we're waiting for her to come back, I'll pose this to the rest of the group. What sort of situations would you all consider appropriate for either homeschooling or religious education or religious schooling? Or are there any? So, there's Beatrice.
I think that there's certainly circumstances where having alternatives to the public schools are really important. Some children experience abuse and bullying in public schools, and that can include, LGBTQ kids. I've seen multiple circumstances where queer kids were getting bullied in the public school and they wanted to be withdrawn to be homeschooled. And either they were, and then it was, a positive experience for them, or they weren't. And then, they ended up suffering greatly to the point, some of them have killed themselves. So I think that we need to have options for kids who are not doing well in the normal school systems. And I think but we need to focus on what the children in those circumstances want and need. So it's not a matter of, the parents' right to homeschool. I think we should be focusing more on the child's right to the education itself, if that makes sense, the distinction there. Like, we should be prioritizing children's rights in these circumstances, not the parents' rights.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense, Ryan. So
Can I just add to that? In the Yoder ruling, even though judges mentioned it, that the children's viewpoint wasn't being argued, nobody ever did anything about it. And they knew better. The children at the time of the ruling actually had the right. Children had the right to be represented in court. I'm not a constitutional scholar, so I maybe don't trust me on. But my understanding is that the children had the right to have representation in the courtroom, but it just never happened.
Great, yeah, and I don't know that any of us are constitutional scholars, so we'll trust you as far as that goes, Elam. But
don't trust me.
Beatrice, we got you back. What were you saying about kind of the impact or the aspect of religious homeschooling or religious schooling?
Yeah, so I think the point I was trying to get across is that it says just as much the responsibility of what has happened to the education system in the community is just as much responsibility of the lawmakers and politicians that should be enforcing it. Because the fact is they have not enforced it. They have let decades go past without enforcing things. And I think that is the only way we'll see improvement. It's really hard to improve a community that's so fearful of making change. So having those lawmakers on the outside make those changes. And, one of the terrible things that happened initially because there is a review of the law currently in New York State, was that some of the Catholic schools and elite Jewish schools that do provide an education that enables their students to end up going to Ivy League colleges. Now, the other things that teach over there, I'm not going to discuss that, but the fact is the kids have the possibility of going to college, which is almost impossible for the kids that graduate the education system that my son goes to. And they sided together with these schools in opposing any changes. The way it's formatted right now, they're not doing that because they've kind of been given a pass as long as there's some oversight. But the fact is there are religious schools across the country that are providing a lot better of an education. And there are kind of levels in this, and the expectation that the states or the federal government should be providing oversight in terms of minimal standards is not something so radical. A restaurant that opens up here in New York City gets a grade every year, right? Somebody comes in unexpected, checks, are things okay, and gives them a grade. Like, why aren't our children deserving of that kind of oversight?
I think that's a great point, Beatrice. We have that sort of oversight to protect the public, right, in many, many different areas, whether that's transportation, food service, so many areas. And so, why don't we have that for this area, right, of kind of homeschooling, religious schooling, or both?
I'd like to add something that when government officials collaborate to advance these religious authorities' wishes, to me, and again, I'm not a constitutional scholar, but to me, that's a violation of the separation of church and state. I would go so far as argue that the Amish are a state-run church because the Yoder ruling completely removed the children's rights to have any access to an opposing view, giving Amish religious authorities just absolute complete control to turn their schools into indoctrination centers. And that was done with the help of the Supreme Court. And somebody needs to examine the extent that this is a state-run religion at that point.
Interesting. Jerusha, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. It becomes a question of community health. And, just like we have public health and with transit or restaurants or, whatever kind of safety, what do we as communities believe children have the right to know, to learn? So to prepare them for whether it's just to be a productive part of the economy or for their own benefit and safety. And so, yeah, I think looking at it from a public health standpoint might help to see the analogies with, do children have a right to learn anything? And if so, what do we agree that they should have access to or not?
Yeah, so if we're saying people need to be educated, it seems like what I'm hearing from many folks is we need to have equal standards for the education that children must be kind of having, regardless of maybe where it's happening, right? In a homeschool, in a religious school, public schools, private schools. It seems like there need to be standards enacted.
Which tends to concern people because they feel like their rights are being trampled.
Yes, because I think a lot of people here in the U.S., especially, and I'm sure in other countries, have this idea that rights are somehow whatever I happen to decide they are, right? As in my right to do whatever the hell I want, right? Like that's what my rights for so many people mean, instead of some sort of maybe more operationalized definition there. We've got some other great questions that we can get to. one of those, and you all may or may not be aware of this, I don't, that's why I'm asking it, is are there any quantitative or qualitative studies out there documenting developmental differences between the homeschooled and the non-homeschooled? So in terms of socioeconomic status, class, mental health, are any of you aware of, I'm sure that stuff's out there, but are any of you aware of that?
Yeah, most of the studies on homeschooling have been self-selective. So, what Jerusha was mentioning earlier, that what is the case in her state where they don't keep track of how many homeschoolers there are. That would be the case in most of the states too. So we don't really have the capability to conduct the surveys in the way that we need to actually find out how homeschoolers are objectively doing across the board, unfortunately. So the surveys we do have are self-selective, and so most of those come from families that are like middle class. They're going to have two parents. They'll be, white and tend to be evangelical. So what we see in those studies generally is that those children tend to have they have less of the traditional behavioral issues that you're going to see in public schools, like drinking or stealing or anything like that. Of course, I'm just speaking in generalizations. But instead, in the homeschooling, you see them acting out in different ways, in more subtle ways. And so you'll see, self-injury, and you'll see mental health issues where they're, kind of more the results of suppressing things as opposed to acting out. Because, of course, anytime a child in one of these strict homes acts out, they're going to be, spanked. They're going to be beaten. They're going to be kind of, their wills are going to be broken, essentially. And so they're going to be acting out in different ways, if that makes sense.
Yeah, more what we would call internalizing problems.
Externalize, yeah.
Externalize.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can say that there are no studies for Amish kids, and considering that this is actually this coming month is the 50th anniversary of the ruling, I think that is a scandal that this major change in policy was made and nobody's paying attention.
Well, and my guess, and you all can help correct me if I'm wrong, is kind of like Ryan said, it's so much of that's due to the self-selection, right? So we're showing that maybe homeschooling is fantastic because we took this very small sample as opposed to the entire piece, right? We're cherry picking some of the data. It sounds like maybe what Ryan was talking about, or just completely ignoring any sort of data collection or long-term tracking, which is what Elam was just mentioning. So it sounds like one of those issues where we could have some great information, but we don't have the buy-in maybe of the populations or the communities to track that or to see.
If I can just add to that, there are no studies, but you will absolutely be hit with an onslaught if you raise the question, the Amish are doing great, blah, blah, blah. There's not a politician on the earth who won't fall all over themselves to praise the Amish for 1,000 virtues. But it's all propaganda. There's no data behind it. The Amish have become this Rorschach test that people just project their ideology on, and the right-wing Christian conservative movement is vested in saying the Amish are great. They don't need government. Look how fine, how well they're doing. But it's all propaganda.
Yeah. Well, kind of related to many of the things that many people talked about. We had another question, was how can therapists or mental health professionals help either support or advocate for those children who've gone through homeschooling, or religious schooling that was traumatic in some way, or the adults who now have gone through that and are trying to live their life. So what would you all say about, how can we as a mental health community support or advocate for them?
I'd say two things. One would be to, educate yourselves about religious trauma. I mean, this conference is a great practice in that regard. And then I would say also reach out to the children and the parents in your lives that you do know that are homeschooling or are involved in private education, and see what kind of partnerships you can develop there. Like if you are a social worker and your expertise is child protection, and you know a family that's in a homeschool co-op, like reach out and offer to give a presentation on child abuse prevention. Or if you're a mental health practitioner, find a organization and a convention where you can go and give a presentation on mental health issues. So think about the ways that you can, reduce the fear that those communities have about outside intervention, so that they can see that you're willing to work with them and you're not the scary other that they think that you are. That's what I would say.
Yeah, having a therapist helped me she was validating as I would tell my stories. And it was good to have a wall to bounce my experiences off of, because she understood kind of the more normal baseline of mainstream society. And I was coming from this completely different culture. And she encouraged me to just remain curious, to keep learning, whether it was taking arts classes or going for more college credits. I think it helped me to know that my experience wasn't set. That wasn't where I needed to stay. I could keep repairing damage or just move on past that. And that was a helpful step for me.
There's a really sort of vicious dynamic. Go ahead. Am I on?
Yes.
That happens in the Amish community, where they have power over the therapists that their people see. And if those therapists introduce ideas that cause trouble in the community, they blacklist those therapists. So the therapists essentially become a propaganda arm of the church. And it is a problem.
There's that issue of control again, huh? Yeah. Beatrice, any kind of...
Yeah, I mean, really, what I would say is, first of all, validating the experience. Like, the experience is very real. And I think if those people who are here, those therapists are here, are probably already acknowledging that religious trauma is real, and religious schooling is another layer on top of it. My experience going to college in my mid-30s, after I didn't end up graduating high school because I was sent to a religious seminary before I graduated. That was so empowering, like knowing that I can be out in the bigger world, get a college degree. And then I went on to a graduate degree. That was so affirming to me. So I think those two things, but I will echo in regards to, I forgot your name, what Elam spoke about the Amish, that to go directly into the schools or into the community is very challenging. For the most part, at this point, they've really set up where the only therapists that kind of are allowed are ones that, would never consider religious schooling a trauma. They would never, ever look at it that way. So it's really hard. But I think when somebody is already coming out and is already approaching and is open to hearing, I think really recognizing it for what it is and providing support is incredibly important.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists for being here and sharing your stories and answering questions. Really appreciated that. And with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Janice and let her take the reins.
Thank you, panel, and thank you, Dr. Lack. That was not only interesting, I found it very moving. I teared up a few times. I homeschooled my own children. So there have been a lot of apologies that have been necessary on my part. And I also encouraged my children to seek secular therapy now after the fact. And so I'll give a shout out to seculartherapy.org. And some of you may have found it somewhat triggering, this whole talk, which was so significant and I think really helpful. So I encourage you right now to do whatever you need to do to regulate your own nervous system, whether you need to take a little walk, get a drink of water, do some breathing exercises. We want to be conscious of that during this conference. So now we have about 15 minutes before I come back with our next speaker. I'm really excited to have Dr. Clint Haycock joining us. And in that 15 minutes, I hope you will take a look at the exhibit hall and see what we have going on there. And so I look forward to seeing you all again in about 15 minutes.